Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. With me today is Jose of DO Creative. Jose, how are we doing today?
I'm doing good, Craig. How are you?
It's great to have you on. You are the great filmmaker that's done a couple of my films, The History of the Papacy in 12 Minutes, and also, of course, greatest hit I've ever done, Hidden History of Early Christian Art, that you've turned to script and you've made into a magnificent piece of art. And I think it's great to have everyone be able to hear from you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And those are great projects to make, good fun. And we brought something, I think that's very rich for everybody. So I was just happy to work on it with you.
I mean, it's been a real pleasure to be able to collaborate with you. Now, for people not aware, I won't get into details, but Jose and I met in the real world in one of the earliest Orthodox churches I've ever been to. And so it just kind of been a relationship that's come off from there. And what I really do appreciate, what comes out in the film, is we kind of, at least I feel, operate on a very similar wavelength where you visually, audio, all the things that go into storyboarding, put together a film, kind of you understand what this script is getting at and how to portray it visually and with audio. And so, like, if I was working with someone that had no clue, wasn't on that wavelength, I think it would hurt the projects from having the production that they do have. It really makes what I write come to life. So that's how I feel. Now, whether positive or negative, how have you felt as the video producer, maker, really the chief creative architect of this work, of dealing with my written word and then turning that into something visual?
I'd say it's basically the same thing, but inverted, where I'll have images and ideas for certain scenes, things that will look cool. And usually I don't do the audio, but I can hear it in my mind, right? Like, oh, that will sound cool if this and that happens. But then the words, the research, that's always, sure, I could do it, but there's people that have more extensive knowledge and they can bring stuff to the script that I wouldn't. And it's also like that research, people have their skills. And I'd say you have obviously that with the research and the writing. So it's like, yeah, let's get somebody who has that plus with the videos and bring them together. And to what you said, bringing certain like paragraphs or sentences in the script to life. Sometimes something will just stick out very obviously that this should be on the video, this should happen. Sometimes it's while you're editing it, that's when you get hit with, oh, this is what should happen. And then maybe you edit something later on and then you realize, oh, let me go back and add this there. So it kind of happens a little bit while I was reading the script. And then while I'm editing, new things present themselves. But to your point, it's inverted where it's good to have somebody who has the research and will write it. And then I'll bring the video to it.
I think it requires from both sides an understanding what the other person does. And because there's a lot of what you did with your own research and reading some of the resources that are cited in the film, just so you could get more ideas for imagery and more ideas for, well, how do I present this? So you have to actually have to understand it. And on the flip side, I, as the writer, have to have some idea. Here's certain things visually you may be doing, or certain things that should be touched up. And so it requires being informed about what the other art is per se in order to make it come to life. And so I think still though, right, you and I ultimately did very different functions in the making of this film. And a lot of the, maybe not unsaid heroes, but less said heroes, which are in the credits that did a lot of the music and other things help you out. It's this large collaborative effort. Yes. We all work together. And so that's been something that's been just a real honor for me. We have here below Abu Honda, new to your channel. Well, it's nice to have you here. What we'll do is you guys could do audience questions as we go. We're pretty much going to do a uninterrupted director's commentary of the film. We'll both make some comments now before on the overall project, and then we'll get into particulars as it rolls. First things first, obviously, because we're doing this in real time, there might be facets like you didn't answer this question about the film, about this scene, that scene. There's limited time to do so. So if you feel there needs to be something that you want a little more detail from the director, from myself, you could write it as a question, and we will obviously address it at the end.
We're going to be here for 10 hours, guys. Don't worry.
No. Well, not me. Maybe you. I have a branch for tree and a chainsaw to deal with after we're done. But that being said, it's we'll be able to address it that way. As just like an overall comments from the beginning, one thing I found very interesting was just kind of how the project became much larger than I initially imagined it. I imagined it as a kind of basic film with some still pictures and words on the side, right? And kind of like the typical picture from Wikipedia comments, white, white letters, and then like almost really a glorified slideshow with maybe some like, if you remember, I said, oh, here's a cool clip from Superbook, which shows cherubim in the temple, and like, some kitschy things in between. And when Jose, when you started putting it together, it started taking on this very like larger than life, extremely professional ethos, which is like was way beyond what I would expect of someone to do as a charity project, essentially. And so you really owned the project and did something really spectacular with it. And that's why I think it was really fitting that was on Harmony's channel. So for those who want to see the whole film without our voices in it, you could go to Harmony's channel and the videos there. And so like, I think that's just one thing from the beginning. I just want to say to people as an overall thing about the film that maybe people aren't aware. I don't know if you have any such comments like that, Jose.
That's interesting that from your perspective, you're seeing it as like, instead of it being a sort of glorified PowerPoint, it kind of became something a little more. From my perspective, I do agree, but I was thinking, I'm like, oh man, a lot of these things can be way better. These shots there could be more here. It could be a little more aesthetic. Looking back at it now, I do see like, okay, yeah, on the whole, it's a very nice project. It has its style. But that's just from your perspective, and that's something that I've spoken with others as well, where it's like we, as the person that's editing it, and I'm sure you writing it, it's almost like a funnel. The end script is the shorter, or the smallest part of the funnel, where that's what the audience sees. But then, of course, you have all these other things that you could have added, and only you know that. Same thing on my side, where the video looks the way it looks, but then it's like, I could have done X, Y, and Z, could have added this, could have done that, but like nobody sees that. So then it's interesting that from your perspective, it's like, oh, whoa. But then from my perspective, I'm thinking, oh yeah, but I could have added this, that. So I'm sure it's the same thing with the writing.
I think there's two things here. Like the first is from, let's say, the writing vantage point. There's all sorts of like proof texts that could have been used that weren't, because they didn't build into the overall argument of the film. Like, for example, St. Methodius and the images of angels and stuff like that. Like, by reviewing the archaeological evidence, it's almost like you don't need to even discuss that passage, because there's no dispute based on the archaeological evidence. There's pre-ante-Nicene images. Like, there's just no doubt. And so like visually, the argument's already made without me having to write that out. So like you said, in the funnel, you have to be mindful of the medium, and that kind of affects what you choose to discuss. It's not that I couldn't discuss all sorts of different things. It's just that they have not been relevant given what's already established thanks to the visual medium. The other aspect is because this is so information dense, it makes it, I think, tough for someone like you to make it as visually dramatic as you would want to. Sure. Because the visuals serve the information, while very often with something less dense and less controversial, the information serves the visuals, right? So like take something on Harmony, there's these things about the spiritual life, which aren't like massive forms of debate. So like then the visual could really be what's said could really then be driven home through the visual and audio. While here it's so information dense, especially given the controversy surrounding it, you almost have to have the opposite. And at least again, I know you maybe are your worst critic, but I feel you rode that line very successfully.
Thank you. Yeah.
So
that was
you
that was the feeling, because we have all the quotes, and then many times on certain pages of the script, it's kind of paragraph, all building up to this one point, and it's visually it's like, oh, what are you going to add here? So then that's why there are those animations in the video where it's not just the white screen with the text. There's the animation of, let's say, I do want to ask you this later. What are some of your favorite shots? But I'll say mine now. The censer when the Holy of Holies, when the priest is.
You love that censer. I think you used that shot twice.
Exactly. I was like, that's like a good place to add something like that to kind of spice it up. If the quote or whatever is being said is kind of going on for a little too long, we don't want to hold on the text so much, but we'll come back to it. So I'd say that was kind of like the struggle of having the text actually on the screen with whatever visuals that we can put in that are relevant to what's being said.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to get started with the film. Jose, feel free to interrupt. We're going to be like Mystery Science Theater in the bottom, making our comments. And hopefully it gives some of the real fans of the film insight as to what the main creative forces anyway behind it thought about it. Of course, special thanks to Michael Garden, Evangelos Nikotopoulos, obviously Harmony, all the different people that did all these different aspects of the film as well. So if you're ready, let's get started.
I was just going to ask you before we start, unless you want to wait until it happens. What was your favorite?
Right after your question.
Your favorite shot? Go.
I don't know.
Unless you want to wait until it shows up.
Let me wait till it shows up. That's my favorite.
All right. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
It is the year
now, the interesting thing about this shot, it was the last one done. It's interesting in movies where the movie Patton, where the first thing the movie was actually the last thing shot. And so this whole montage at the beginning is the very last thing done. And it was because there was some difficulty as to like, all right, how do we do this? And again, my idea was very much like the PowerPoint idea, and to really focus on a real picture of a catacomb. And that kind of then this gave the inspiration not to do a full-blown cartoon, but really do this kind of take Priscilla, the condual, whatever her name is, and put her in a real catacomb. Just came out wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, this was when I first read that part of the script, I was like, oh, this has to be. We have to actually show somebody in a catacomb looking at these frescoes. The mix between her being a cartoon illustrated and the actual images of the catacombs, that kind of came later on, mainly because how would we get somebody to draw the frescoes? I figured since the whole entire video we're actually showing the real ones.
That montage right here, excellent. I mean, hits you right at the heart, which is important because the heart has to be open to hear what the film has to say. I just want to point that out. I loved what you put together right there.
People are constantly creative, looking for outlets to
now, like, there's been some, like, the beginning of the film kind of gets into this fine of macro theological stuff, which in short, we're made in the image of God. God is a creator, and right, creation's his art. And so when we make icons, that's our art. And in a lot of these debates, we become so detached from the anthropological realities that are, I think, necessary in basic theology, that we become detached
One such
from
picture with inclinations
really what's
against
most
the directions
relevant
of
in the
God
debate.
and that of pagan
And
deities,
so that's why
were
the
the
film, I
ancient
think, starts
Israelites
here
of the
very
Old
successfully
Covenant.
so, because
However,
someone who
they
were
were not
to
against all
oppose
religious
the
art.
thesis of the film
They
couldn't
created figures
address
of cherubim,
this very
lions,
basic
oxen, palm trees,
anthropological,
and the like
theological
for
reality.
use in their religious ceremonies.
Yeah, nowadays maybe
Demonstrating
we're a
they
little too
differentiated
bookish.
between idolatrous
This is my
and
favorite shot, by the way.
non-idolatrous images.
Ah,
That's my favorite. The way you put together where it's like where it's living, by the way.
okay. The second time I used this shot was when I actually made it 3D, and then I went back to when it shows up here and added
Yes,
that
I
one.
remember that. And that's the one that made it into the orthochristian.com article. They used that image. So I think maybe that's most people's favorite image, favorite shot in the film, because it really does make you feel like you're in that synagogue. It's done very well. So is there a reason for a dramatic pause at the end of this part right here?
Of Christian art.
Longest pause. That's the longest pause in the film. It's right there.
You timed it?
Not only the first piece of Judeo-
No, that was I paused it.
What may be properly
So
classified
in my
as
mind,
the
it's like,
first
oh, so you can
icon of
read
God,
the rest of the
or perhaps
verse,
better classified
and then also
as
I
the
think it
proto-icon.
it felt
This was the Ark of
like,
the
oh, let me
Covenant.
kind of hold it
It
for a
was very
beat.
different from what
before
people would
continuing
consider
on.
an icon
Yeah,
today.
the scriptures and the
Icon is
patristic
not
text
merely a religious
fluttering into the
depiction,
film,
but it
no
is
one
a
in the first
representation
watch
of
is going to
God
get them
Yeah.
all.
saints used
They're
for
all
religious
there,
adoration.
so
The Greek from
really
which
for
the word
polemical
derives
reason.
from expresses
If
a
people start
close
opposing what
connection
the
between the depiction
spoken
and
script
what
is
depicted.
saying, then they have to
The
deal
type
with all
and the
these
prototype.
citations that make the argument. And
The
so
ark at
the
first
the
strikes
passive
one as
watcher
something
is getting
entirely
something,
different
and
from an
the
icon.
intense
It doesn't look like
really
However, it would be incorrect to infer
the
that
viewer
ark
who's given
was
lots of
understood
scrutiny
in that it
is
was
also
God's
getting
footstool,
something.
as
Yeah, we
the
did
And I
talk
think
about
piece
that,
of divine
where
furniture,
somebody
as opposed to
who,
a representative type
like you
of a
said, nobody on
prototype.
the first watch is going to pause
Favoring a
and read and then go and
Christocentric
research
understanding of
something.
Old Testament
You'll
cultic
watch it and then you'll
practices,
go through,
the
and there's all these
iconographic
little
view
things
is
that
more favorable.
you can
In the
bite
Septuagint,
into.
the
But
Greek
it's there,
translation of the Old
so it's not like we're leaving
God
something
states
out.
in
Somebody's
Exodus,
asked, oh, but what
"I will
about this
make
and that?
myself known to thee from
No, it's
thence,
there.
and I will speak
You
to
gotta
thee
take your
above
time.
propitiatory
Now,
between the
what
two cherubs,
what
which are
offended
upon
some
the Ark of the
Orthodox
Testament."
viewers is the
These things can be
Christocentric typology of the ark.
God intends to be
Because so
made for
often
the ark,
in
not
apologetics, all
literally
people
step
talk
down
about,
upon it,
Mary's
but
the
be
ark,
perceived from it,
Mary's the ark,
even heard.
and
I told you
this
that.
is true
Schema being presented,
typologically, but it's a
God speaks
secondary
above the
type. In the
propitiatory.
patristics,
He's speaking above the
primarily
propitiatory, but
it's
he
about
is to God the
Christ,
Father,
and that's why
who
that quote
cannot
from
be
St.
seen,
Hippolytus that comes
because
up is so
no one
important,
has seen the
and it's
Lord.
especially
John
relevant for this
6:46.
topic because that
And the
ark really is an
propitiatory itself
icon.
pertains to the Son, whose
You know,
blood expiates
and
the sins of mankind.
really the only way to say the ark is not an icon is to say no.
The ark is a physical
Christ,
object
Christ,
which
Christ or
foreshadows
God's
Jesus
divine
Christ,
essence
whose human
was
essence will become
physically
visible at
present
the incarnation.
there, like in
In
time and
contrast
space
with
above
God the
the
Father,
ark.
situated
And
invisibly
while
above
there's
it,
maybe
whose divine
less
person
informed
contains
Protestants that
only
would
the
make that
invisible
argument,
divine
no
essence,
informed
which
Protestant
is
apologists
incapable
will,
of depiction.
because to
The
do that,
proceeding
you
is
have to
understood
reject
by
the
the
doctrine of
Church's
divine
earliest writers.
simplicity.
The
And that puts
Pilatus
you
of
totally
Rome observed,
disconnected, pretty much
"The ark
universal
made of
tradition of,
imperishable wood
of
was
every
the Savior himself."
magisterial
This is
and
from the commentary on
apostolic
"The Lord is my
church.
Shepherd" in fragments.
And so for
In
that
the
reason, I
tabernacle
knew
where
I
the ark
wasn't
was
going to get a lot
located,
of pushback
in
on
front
that
of it
point
was the
because
sevenfold
the only
lampstand
way
and
to
showbread.
reject this
The
reading of
former
St.
representing the
Hippolytus
Holy Spirit
would be
proceeding
to
from the
reject
Father
divine
through the
simplicity.
Son
So that
to
was
the
something
Church,
really
and the latter
interesting. I think
made
that was
apparent
implicit
in
in
the
the
world
script there.
through the light of the lampstand.
Yeah, I remember I
Just as
mentioned to you,
Christ
like,
is
oh, don't we want to
incarnate by
add
the
something
Holy
about
Spirit.
Mary here? But the
Understanding
focus
the typological
was Christ,
significance
and
of
then
the objects in the
these
tabernacle
symbols
in this way,
can have
one may
multiple
perceive that the priests
connection
there,
points. We don't have
when
to
sensing the
stress
ark,
every single
were
one.
venerating Jesus Christ.
There's your
They
favorite scene right
understood that
there.
the ark
There
was
it
not
is.
literally
And
God,
you added
nor
added
did
little
they
touches there,
sacrifice
like
animals
pattern.
or pray
You
to
put the
ark.
Greek there, typos.
Rather,
That was
the
not in the
ark
script.
received
That's
what
something
was
you
due to
added,
God,
you perceived
as it
as
was a
very
type
important.
receiving veneration in place of
The
prototype,
passage First
God
Kings is
himself.
covered by our faces, but
Sacrifices
Yeah.
were offered,
I
and
assure you,
prayers made to
viewers, it's
him
very
it
important as
represented.
well. And
Jerome, a church father,
and this
well
passage
acquainted
from
with
Saint
Judaism,
Jerome is very
asserts
underrated
that the
because
ark
it's
and
just
the holy
Saint
objects
Jerome in
surrounding
passing
it
taken
were
for
venerated
granted
by the early Jews,
that what
akin to
was
the
in
latter
the Holy of
Christian
Holies was
practices.
venerated.
The
And
Jews
so
of old
again, all
reverenced the
these
Holy of
things are
Holies
to drive
because of the
home
things contained in
the
it:
fact that
the
yes,
cherubim, the mercy
this
seat, the Ark
interpretation
of the
here
Covenant,
is that
the
the
manna,
Ark of the
Aaron's
Covenant
rod,
is
and
this
the
sort of
golden altar.
proto icon,
Does the Lord's
right? It was
sepulchre
treated as an
seem less
icon.
worthy of
And
veneration?
so So it's
Receiving
almost so
veneration
many
in
different
our worship.
evidences where
This does
without
not
getting
mean
to,
that
you
the
know,
ark was
personal
not
attacks,
both
something
holy
like
and
someone can't
powerful.
actually
When Jesus
intellectually
touched the ark to prevent it from
um
falling,
responsible way respond to it. And now this part is interesting with the touching of the ark and the power that exudes. Because this creates the connection between early Jewish material culture and Christian material culture, and establishes the connection between that and icons, which I think is often missing from apologetics and the whole debate about it. It's a very Jewish-centric approach, right? I establish the integral doctrines within Judaism and then build up from that.
Iconographic symbols which represent God.
Yeah, it wasn't just a symbol that exists up in the air. It was actually right there, and if you touch it, there's some consequences.
The most obvious example of this,
well, because there's power in the symbol, right? Like the mezuzah is seen as apotropaic. The phylactery, as we'll get to in a moment, seen as apotropaic. And, you know, as you're portraying here visually, that, yeah, these aren't like, oh, these are some Jewish heretics or whatever, or like, or this is a later Jewish practice. The visually and the script convey that no, these things existed at the time of Christ, that the apostles have been very aware of the existence of these holy objects. And so we're establishing the existence of proto-icons in the chapter 1 and now in chapter 2, holy objects, and how these holy objects work, right? They work as windows into heaven. Because often in the debate, no one wants to defend that, yes, icons are windows into heaven, but that's actually literally how a holy object works, and that doesn't come from Christianity or paganism. It originates in Judaism.
Also proven by their preservation at Qumran was the wearing of phylacteries.
So you did great 3D work there. How did he do that, by the way? Like, what kind of program does that?
So yeah, for the phylactery on the left, that was it's a program called After Effects, which is mainly for compositing and 2D motion graphics work. But recently, they've added, in the last like 5 years, really actually since it started, you can do 3D type work. And then if you mess around with it, you can rotate planes and layers in the z-axis and then like bring it all together.
You're getting very specific now.
And make it look 3D. So it's 3D, but it's not done in a 3D program, a traditional 3D program.
Now, that being said, I want to make a point here with this interpretation of St. Justin Martyr, where literally like 2 days after the film came out, a brand new archaeological find in Germany found a Christian phylactery from the 3rd century, which literally spelled out, this is how I understand this phylactery works.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just now the interpretation of the film. Literally 2 days after the film came out, a brand new archaeological find was discovered and released to the public, saying, "Yep, this is actually true." So I kind of feel God did us a solid that people wouldn't say, "Oh, this film's going out on a limb here," because now at least archaeology spelled out the interpretation of the film being correct. So I found that pretty interesting.
And the hand of Providence was waiting for us to release it. It's like, okay, now I'll let the archaeologists find it.
It was probably already found, but he let the news article come out anyway.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But yeah, it's humbling. You know, it shows that we're part of something bigger, right? Maybe you and I aren't so special, but there's definitely something bigger involved. And I don't think in the history of this debate, you know, there's been something more traction than this film. You know, to get into the polemical aspect of it. So it's kind of crazy. This film is, in that sense, historical. And it's thanks to the technology and the circumstance. You know, you and I are relatively humble artists when it comes to something like this, but it's definitely big in that aspect. By the way, Roman Catholics signed the cross, but done backwards. I saw that. That's what you did there, Jose.
Yeah. You can find that image on Google. But
there you go.
Just reversed it.
Now, this was an awesome shot you used because it really made Pompeii come to life with those street crosses and the movement. Because, right, those are still images from a academic book, but you made it come to life with the movement, which was great. And I love that ossuary. because it shows you how the Jews had crosses. It's amazing. And just in this few seconds, this is stuff that most people haven't seen and aren't aware of, and we still really don't have enough.
Fantastic. May have borrowed the cross from the
And I sneaked in this little thing like, well, there's some of this in paganism too, which my guess is it's from biblical typology and the sun cross being a representation of God, because God dwells in inapproachable light, right? So it's something that they used as a symbol because of its connection to light.
And served the same role as a mezuzah.
Now this is the cool one. We did the Sator square.
Archaeologists assert
Now
it predates an
it's
earthquake
interesting.
in 62
I say there's a Sator square in Pompeii, but there's actually two, right?
Yeah, I was
You
wondering
know,
if there was more.
we just focus on this one here because it's a picture, but there's actually two in Pompeii. And you added the Manchester square, right? The second earliest or third earliest one. And then there's the fourth earliest one there from Dur Europus.
As one can see,
Yeah, those are one of those things while I'm editing it, doing the research, trying to find a picture that I'm like, oh, there's this Manchester Sator square. Let me also add that in.
Recent scholarship has conjectured.
Look what you did here. I mean, simple, right? But very effective because it spells out, yes, this really is a cryptogram. And yes, it really says our Father. It clearly makes a cross. And it drives home that either Judaism was very Christian or these were clearly Christian symbols. I personally think the Sator squares are actually Christian. But that being said, Judaism was very Christian, and that's why a lot of these Jews converted to Christianity when they heard the gospel.
Venerated and understood in essentially the same way.
And there you go. That Sator square there from Dur Europus was actually put in a pagan temple, probably from a soldier to ward off evil. And we added all the way to the left the first century one, just so someone can't say, oh, you know, that other one's from centuries later. So I asked for that to be included. It doesn't look as pretty as the 3D ones.
I was like, Craig, no.
We had to. You don't understand.
The aesthetic, you're killing me. But for the shot where we see the square in like that gray room, I was trying to emulate these museum type pictures.
Now, someone complains about the dome there, and there's a lot of subtlety in this part of the film where I have to establish, and that was discovered this year too, an actual picture of an Israelite cherubim. That yes, the Israelites made images of angels, and yes, it was after the first temple. It wasn't like just all images disappeared. And so because people are going to say, well, the Jews had no images. Yes, they did. No, well, they went away. Well, the historical evidence implies no, they didn't. That they physically existed. And it makes sense they physically existed because what was manifest could be depicted, right? They can't depict God because he was not manifest yet in the visual creation until the incarnation. And so that's what we're establishing here visually and in the script.
Of depiction. With the advent of Christian history, the subjects of art were necessarily expanded.
Well said, script. Well said.
In fact, Christianity's
now, and then we get into Eusebius. And to make a long story short, Anti-Nicene church historian flat out says, yes, icons existed in the first century. I mean, that's the point of his story. You could say you don't believe him, but that is the point of his story, and that's what we take the time here to detail the point of that story. And the fact that there's healings from the statue, and it just so happens the healings occurred, just so happens where the bottom of the cloak is, seems to imply this was used as an icon. So it's a very interesting story because it essentially says, yes, people had this view of iconodulling in the first century. Because it's not decorative art if people are approaching it to get healed by it.
It is nothing marvelous.
And I have to ask, are many people aware of the Paneas statue? Because I only came to know about it when I first read this script.
No, I think now they are. But let me just add this to this one passage with this translation. The only error in the film that really irks people, there's a typo. The word ethnic was left out. Now, the spoken script makes mention of these ethnic particulars, that this was a pagan practice imported into Christianity. So it's not like there's a cover up
common in
here,
church
but
history is
regrettably,
neutral,
my typo
explaining that
prevented
the
you
sight
from
of
doing
an
as good a
icon
job
that
as
was
you could have
venerated
done.
was nothing
It's a
marvelous,
cover-up.
but rather expected.
It's a cover up,
This
you
custom was
know.
taken for granted by
But
Gentile
that being
converts,
said,
the ethnic
it's
background of Christians in Peneus.
there's no
The comment about
evidence that
paintings
the apostles
implies their
opposed
common
this, and
use
that's
in the
where
church.
this script then
Though pointing
goes.
this
Like
out
the
may
only evidence we
imply the
have
use
is the
of
apostles
statues
could have,
such
you know,
as the one
used
described
icons, because
was
we
more
have this from
exceptional in
Galatians,
religious
which will come up in a
context.
second.
Exceptional
And so
enough
we
to
have
warrant the
we have an
second
anti-Nicene
account in
historian
apology
saying yes, it was
existed.
imported from pagan practice,
Eusebius, in
and
relating
we
this
just have
story,
no evidence the
reveals what he
apostles rejected
understands to
this.
be the origin of
And
Christian
that's
iconography.
where we
It
go,
began
and that's
among
why
Gentile
we later
converts who
talk about Saint
customarily made art
Dionysius.
forms of local
And
saviors.
I
When
let
becoming
people,
Christian,
they'll say,
they
oh,
did
well,
the
how
same
dare
with
you quote
Christ and
this?
his
Well, then
apostles.
argue with the
This
scholarship
custom
that says
apparently
it's
began among
authentic.
those evangelized
That's why
by
it
Jesus
says
Christ
if
himself,
authentic.
and there is no
This is
record of
maybe
it being
why, because
censored.
otherwise we
The
just know,
apostles
yes,
didn't
it
correct
exists
this
in the first
practice.
century,
In fact,
and maybe
it
this is
appears
how
they
it was
adopted it
understood.
themselves, as the Apostle Paul makes reference to evangelizing.
Here it is.
And I like the slight movement
O
on the still
foolish
image
Galatians,
that you do to make it
before
come to
whose
life
eyes
there.
Jesus Christ was
Of that,
clearly
the slight
portrayed among
movement,
you
that
as
shot
crucified.
was from the, you
Corroborating
know how
this
Oh,
every
the
once in a
film.
while,
Saint
right? You know how
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
every once in a while I'll
preserves
cut to this
mid-second century
art
reference to
documentary.
an icon
That was
of
actually from
crucified
that.
Jesus on a
Oh, I
cross.
see.
It
To
just happened to be there. I was like, oh,
Jewish
perfect.
because
So we
it was
have
not
St.
invested
Paul
with the
saying,
force
yes,
of the
there's a
word
cross.
spoken
That's
about
what
Christ
it
in the
literally
Old Testament.
says.
And
And
in this foolish
then
manner we will
we
accept
have
such
this
things
from
about
Justin
Jesus
Martyr,
Christ in the Old
where
Testament,
if you again
as
read
their
it
teachers
literally,
say,
it
and
says
will we not
that the
carry symbols?
icon of the
Nor
crucified
will we
Christ
discuss
existed.
the icon of the
And
crucified
will
Jesus,
we
since
not
Moses
carry
also,
symbols?
by the stretching out
Right?
of his
They're
hands
talking about
along
carrying
with the
something
invoked
physical.
name of
So if we
Jesus,
give this
was bringing about
metaphorical
your
reading the
people's victory.
passage, it doesn't make
And
sense
so,
with what Justin
whether
Martyr is really
tacitly
saying.
accepted or
And one other
directly
thing,
endorsed,
you
the
had these
apostles
two
consent
amulets here, and that's why I
baptized the
added
former
the
pagan
Ketef
practice of
Hinnom
making
amulet. That was the
images in
last second
homage to their
edition. So that way
saviors
people can
into a
say, look,
Christian
it's
one.
pagan.
As
They
Eusebius
say, oh,
makes
by the way,
clear,
the earliest
the icon at
scripture
Peneus
preserved is actually
maintained
part
the
of an amulet.
theological
And that's why the
aspects
Ketef
of
Hinnom
contemporary
amulet
Jewish
is there.
practices
So that was the
relating to
last
religious
second edition
objects
for
and
that very
ideograms.
particular
From this,
polemical and
the
visual reason.
icon
I don't
is
know if I
born.
told you, but I was gonna add the Ketef
Corroborating
Hinnom
details from the written
amulets
record is the
before,
depiction
and then I
unearthed
was like,
in
ah, it doesn't really
Pompeii
fit here. It
called
doesn't look that
the
good. So
Judgment of
then I
Solomon.
kept that out. And
The
then you
portrait of
mentioned, I was like,
Solomon,
"Psh,
other contemporaries as martyred Romans,
So
you
they
gotta
told
add
me the same wavelength.
Alexandrians.
that's why it couldn't look. That's why they don't look 3D like the other
From this,
amulets."
one can infer a Jewish
Now,
sort
like
of
right here, the
symbolism.
Judgment of Solomon,
Here, that
I
of
think this is the
unrealistic,
single most
ahistorical
biggest
depictions
reveal.
with the intent
Like
that
again,
the
Jewish
figures
historians
symbolize
were
some
aware of
scriptural
this.
characters. As one can
You know,
see,
people that
the
study
characters' glances
Pompeii
are all
are
directed to
aware of this
Solomon,
image, but it
dressed as
never
a
gets
Roman
brought
court
up in the
judge.
discourse.
This is
And
in
I was
stark
turned on to
contrast
this
pagan
by a
imagery
random
from the same
homily
era,
from Father
which
Daniel
attempted to
Syzoyev, who
portray
was very well
historical
read and
realism.
knew about this in Russian
As one can
historical
see,
discourse.
Pompeii frescoes
And so
unearthed
I
in
use this image.
2024
I show other
portray
images like you see
ancient
here
Greek
from
deities and
Pompeii,
historical
where
figures
it's very
wearing
clear
what they
that they
understood to
understood
be
what historical
contemporary garb,
accuracy was. That was a
particularly
big thing with
Venetian.
pagan art. And that's why the
Compare
Renaissance
this to
kind of
standard
follows
Roman
these
clothing of
realistic
the era,
depictions.
the toga.
So
As for the
this
depiction of
picture
Solomon, it
of
was likely
Solomon is
attached to
very
some function
deliberately
of its patron
ahistorical.
relating to
It's very
judgment. The
deliberately
scene and its
symbolic.
purpose are
And so
otherwise
then
difficult to
it
explain.
demands
Due to
us
its
to question,
symbolic
well,
and participatory
Jewish
aspect,
symbolism has
it
this
was
other
likely
meaning.
thought to
This is an
contain the
image
same sort
about
of power
Judaism, and
that
it's
other
a
contemporary
symbolic as
holy
opposed to a
objects,
pagan
such as
literal
the Seder
representation.
square,
What could be
cross,
the significance of
phylactery,
this? And
and the
this is
mezuzah
where
hat.
your work here,
By
Jose,
following
is so
the
important,
characters in the
because you
painting
bring to
and
life
directing
with
one's
those dotted
attention to
lines
Solomon, the
and
judge
with the
may
glow
receive
around the
wisdom from
petitioner
Solomon in dealing
there,
justly.
that they're
Meanwhile,
all looking to
the
Solomon to
plaintiff and
do
defendant may
something.
do the same
And these
in the
visual
hopes of
prompts are
receiving
very
a just
typical in
judgment
ancient
through
art,
his
because
intercession.
the visual prompt in the
If
art is
so,
supposed
the
to
judgment of
prompt the
Solomon was
onlooker to
treated
do
as
the
an
same
icon.
thing. That's the
Nevertheless,
point of the
some may
prompt.
infer
We
that
know this
depictions
from
such as the preceding
I mean,
were
literally, they're
merely
looking
decorative.
at
The
something.
theological
What
rationale
are they?
given for
We're going to
such
want to
art
look
at the
there
turn
too.
of the first century. Accepting the
And we're going to
authenticity
see this in
of
just a
Panaeus's
moment when
the
we
era
get to
project
some of the other
corpus
early icons. But
suggests
this is
otherwise.
mainstream
He
historians
observed,
and
"It
archaeologists are
is
well
not
aware of
possible for our
this.
mind to be
Um,
raised to the
But
immaterial
here we have a
representation
very
and
important passage
contemplation
from St.
of the heavenly
Dionysius,
hierarchies,
because it gives
without
the
using
rationale
material
from someone
guidance
who knew the
suitable to
apostles how
itself,
they understood
counting the
icons.
visible beauties
And so it
as
shows you this
reflections of the
developed
invisible
understanding by
holiness.
kind of dulia as icons as windows into heaven
Similar
very
to the
much
understanding
existed.
of phylacteries Justin
And it
wrote
was
of,
necessarily
according
connected to
Dionysius,
Jewish
mankind
understanding
requires
of
material
religious
objects,
symbols.
here icons, to direct himself to contemplation of the immaterial, or
It's
divine.
the Pope's
God,
crucifix.
the angels, and
There
the
you go.
saints
Well,
in
it's
heaven.
you like to
That
include a
Nicias
lot of the
observation
Romanesque
about
art, I've
icons,
noticed.
reliable
And
as much as he personally knew
so it
several
kind of gives a more
apostles,
inclusive
provides the
ethos to the
theological
film,
rationale they must have
which
used
I'll
to
comment in
accept
the end because
icon
some people don't like the
veneration
ending. Like,
alongside
I'm
the
with
use
you
of
until the
symbols.
ending, and
While
I actually
before
feel
the
the ending
incarnation,
was very
depictions
necessary.
were
But we'll
symbolic
talk
for
about it
those things that
when
were
we're there.
unseen
But this
and
juxtaposition you
visible
did
for
visually
those
here
that
was
were
very
manifest.
important.
Our
In any
faces
event,
are
they were mandated
covering
by
it, but
God as necessary
Yeah.
for
So right
Israelite
to the
religious
left
practice.
is for things
After the
that
death and
are
resurrection of Christ,
invisible, that
suddenly,
can't be
much
depicted.
of
We have
what was
symbols, and things
previously
that are
unseen
visible
was
we
now
could
visible
depict
and
with
capable
actual
of
images.
depiction.
And so obviously
Not
the resurrection
surprisingly,
with
such
the
depictions were
incarnation and
understood as
resurrection,
equally
we could
necessary
depict
for
Christ
religious
now, just like we
purposes.
could depict the
The
angels and the
underlying
angel of the
theology of
Lord,
images
like we
between
see
the
here,
Old
the
and
angel of the
New
Lord
Covenants
of the
remain
three youths,
unchanged.
another icon,
The origin of this
anti-Nicene
doctrine
icon
is not
discovered
obscure.
as the script was being
Underlying
written.
such an understanding is the idea that iconography has both power and a connection to the divine through their veneration, an identical theology to that of the mezuzah, phylactery, and cross. This makes icons not
And
so
so
much
we get
derived
into
from
the
symbols,
importance of
but
symbols, and
existing
you're getting to these
alongside them
later, like
and
more
understood
medieval
as
symbols.
identical
But
in function.
these symbols are in some ways more accessible to
In
us
fact,
than like the
Jewish
kind of
pre-Christian
Jewish
images,
use
such
of
as those of
symbolism.
the angels in the temple, are described
right. I
as
feel like
angelic
many
images
Protestants
of Qumran,
accept
the
like
liturgy used
Mark,
in the temple during
Lion,
their weekly
Matthew,
sacrifices,
the
as
ox.
follows. All these handiworks are living God-like
Now,
beings,
look at
and their
this. All these
figures are
handiworks
holy
are living
angels.
godlike beings, and their figures are
According
holy
to
angels.
Wise,
So,
the
right
saddest
again, this
signs
understanding
of the angelic
images
liturgy
as images
are
into
intended to
heaven.
unite the
And for
worshipper with
those
the
who
angels
say that
worshipping in
angelic
heaven.
liturgy
What
is
happens
somehow
on
like
earth is but a
not
pale
used in the
reflection
temple,
of that
one,
greater
it says
ultimate
it's used in
reality.
the temple.
In Revelations
Two,
9:13, we read, I heard
we
a
have
voice from
scholars
the
to say it
four
was
horns
used
of
in the
the golden
temple.
altar.
And three,
The
the
altar
presumption
speaks,
that the
just
images
as
of
in
the angels
songs.
are alive
The
is if
architecture
it's
is
about
alive.
what's in heaven and not what's
In
on
other
earth,
words, the
why
veneration
would
of
we have
angelic images during the
statues in heaven
liturgy
that are
was
alive?
understood to
Right? It's
connect the
statues on
priests
earth
with
where we'd be
actual
making this
angels.
observation because
It
they're in
cannot be
heaven. There's
emphasized
literal
enough that
angels.
the angelic liturgy,
And
because it was
so
used in
this
such
this
detail,
was important
reflects
because
the
again,
official
it's to
doctrinal
establish
views of
that the
pre-Christian
Jews
Judaism.
at the time of Christ did have a
Archaeological evidence of
understanding
Christian
of
icons from the
images,
2nd
their
to 4th
use,
century
and
further bears
their
out that they
power.
were specifically
And
used
so
in
we see
worship-related
here
contexts,
this whole
similar
idea of
to the
images
Jewish
and power
images
through
of angels.
participation with the
Perhaps the
image,
best
these
and most
praying
ubiquitous
images
example of Christian icons during this era are the depictions of
of
Orants.
Orants, right? So the Orants
Orants
here,
often
and this is
represented
well
a
known because
deceased
Orants aren't
Christian.
original
They were
to
not
Judaism or
realistic
Christianity.
depictions of the
They're
Craig, really
from
quick.
but
paganism in the
symbolically
past.
represented them
And
to the church.
Can
we
you lower
have
the
written,
film audio
Prayer
just a
was
bit?
intentionally
lower it
participatory,
or higher it.
inviting the
Lower it.
onlooker to also
Okay, I'll
pray,
lower it a tiny
to
bit, but
take
I
up
kind of
with
feel
the
like
hymns.
people, sometimes
The
viewers don't
participatory
understand
element and
that this is a
symbolism
commentary. You
demonstrates
kind of have to
obvious
hear it,
continuity with
right,
early Jewish
to
practice
understand
pertaining to
what we're
mezuzahs
talking
and the
about.
Christian use of Seder
So, but that being
The
said,
icon's
the
power, so to say, was
we have an
symbolic,
orance where it
or
literally
may be
spells
classified
out
as
that
simple
you're praying
ritual.
along with this
Looking upon the
image.
depiction,
And so
Yeah.
it's not like some sort
and
of
then
random
responding in prayer.
scholarly,
The intended response
presumption that, oh, when you
oftentimes
see an
was the
orance, it means
literal
you're supposed to
veneration of
copy
another
what it's doing.
icon,
It was
as
well
people were
understood, and
postures,
it's spelled
and
out
sometimes
on
their
one of them
eyes,
that this
when
is what
pointed
you're supposed to
upwards,
do with an
would direct the
orance.
worshipper
And
in
so when they're
prayer
praying
to the
up and they're
icon of the
looking up
Good
at this
Shepherd,
image
the
of the
symbolic
Good Shepherd,
representation of
clearly the
Christ
idea is for
himself.
you to go
A
and pray to
signet
the Good
ring
Shepherd.
dated to the 3rd
And to drive it
century
more home, you
vividly
did this
portrays
AI
this.
rendering of
It
a real
shows
image,
Daniel in the lion's
as
den
you see here to the
assuming the
right,
Orant's
where
posture
it's
of prayer,
Daniel in the lion's den
directing
praying
his
to the Good
devotion
Shepherd.
to the Good
So
Shepherd.
it
This
leaves
leaves
nothing
nothing
to the
to the
imagination that people
as to
understood
what
that's
the
what we do to
understood
this
purpose
image.
was
So if
for
you go,
the use
what's
of
the
the
proof of
icons.
anti-Nicene
Due to
iconodulia
the
that
fact
people
it is
actually
known
pray
that
to the
Christians
images?
pray to
There
an
it
upright
is in
posture
plain
towards
sight.
heaven. This implies that all Christian depictions found on ceilings were not merely religious images, but were used as icons.
And that's a beautiful
Other
catacomb, by the
early
way, probably
archaeological
the
evidence
most
corroborates that the
intricate
art was
for one
venerated
that is
and may
dated
properly
before
be classified as
Nicaea by at
iconography.
least some
The
scholarship, not all.
pre-Nicene grotto of Nazareth contains a graffiti which appears to describe
Now, this
an
the
icon or
actual
relic
academic
bearing
journal
as a
that
horn, a
it's
sort of
citing
veneration
from
practice.
gave permissions, and that's
And
where there's
another
extra
graffiti
permissions for the
says, "Hail
displaying of of these
an
images.
explicit
And there's our
symbol of
earliest Hail
veneration.
Mary.
Even
There you
second
go
or
in the
third
Greek.
century pagans that
And the
criticized
Alexamenos
Christians
graffito,
depicted them
which you did a
venerating
nice
crucifixes.
juxtaposition there to show
Consider
that
the icon
clearly
of the
people
Good
knew their
Shepherd.
crucifixes because
Though
they're
it was
making fun of them.
venerated as a representation of Christ, it was not intended to be a realistic depiction. Rather, it deliberately appeared as the shepherd god Orpheus, symbolically depicting Jesus.
And so we're getting here how they
Similarly,
used
in
well
another
understood
3rd century
pagan
icon,
symbols and then
Christ was
repurposed them
depicted
to
as
be
the sun
Christian
god
symbols.
Helios. The grapevines and branches
which
of this
ironically
icon
actually was unlike
borrowed
the
from
pagans
depictions
who
of
tried to be
Bacchus,
more
the god of wine,
historically accurate with
symbolically
their
represented the
depictions instead of
church,
using
the
this
branches, and the nuts
obvious
of the true
symbolism. And
vine,
that's why the film
Christ.
speculates that this
To the
had to do with
archaeologist,
scrupulosity
what
over
is apparent
images.
is that
And
Christians
so
overtly
to
borrowed
address,
and
oh, well, this is
repurposed
pagan
pagan art
syncretism,
forms.
here we
There
have
is
Saint
clear Jewish
Hezekiah,
precedent for
the
this,
famous
as
king that
King
was
Hezekiah
against
borrowed Egyptian,
paganism,
Phoenician,
did the
and
same exact
Syrian
thing
pagan
himself,
imagery for his
right?
own
Did you
Yeah,
ever
wonders.
see
this
this
is
before,
The
Jose?
fact that Christians conflated the symbols
that
of
it was the
Egyptian
first
paganism
time
shows that they were
that
not
I saw that, but I
advertising
was
being
aware
more
of
than
the
Hezekiah was. Rather,
the tunnels
they
in
were intentionally
Jerusalem that
portraying the
have
superiority
something
of
related
Christ and
to
the church
Hezekiah,
by emulating pagan depictions,
but I forget if
showing
it's
continuity with early Jewish or Christian
an
art,
image or if
such
it's just like
as the
an
Judgment of
inscription with
Solomon.
words.
The
But that was the
symbolism
first
as
time I
opposed
was
to
aware
a
of the bulla.
historical approach to depicting figures
So yeah,
portrays an
it's just an
iconographic
interesting
intent
thing.
behind
The
images.
journal Let the Stone Speaks, literally,
Nevertheless,
as the film was being
sometimes
finished in
plainer, more
production,
historically
was
accurate depictions of Christ and
re-popularizing
the
these
saints were
images, and
made.
that merited their
Jewish
inclusion in the
depictions of
film.
historical
And there you
saints
go,
and
you
heroes
how
of
you
Europus are similar.
what a
These
shot this
conformed more
is, what you put
strictly to the
together here.
realistic expectations of
Really makes it
Greco-Roman
like you entered
portraiture, which
into
opted
the
for
synagogue
historical
there.
realism, as opposed to
But
the
very,
earliest
very
Jewish or
pagan in
Christian
its
depiction.
ethos, really.
The former
If you think
offered
about like
more
the
accurate
the
depictions,
purposeful
as opposed to the
historical
intentional
accuracy
symbolism
there.
inherited
Like
from
even
paganism.
the naked woman in
Even
the
then,
Nile, this
scholars
sort of
observed
idea
that such
of
art was intended to
exoticism
prompt
of
ritual
Egypt and
actions,
stuff, which
thereby
again is
making
more
the art
historically
itself a
grounded and
connection between the
grounded in
worship of
contemporary
Christians and what they
understandings
depict.
as opposed to symbolic.
Nevertheless, it is this more realistic
It's the
Judeo-Christian
early
art that, in
Orientalist.
fact, shows dependence upon
There kind of
Greco-Roman
was. We
art,
actually have
as opposed
aspects
to
of that
more
in
symbolic
Pompeii.
icons, which
And
were
it's
literally
interesting how
depicting
you brought in
figures
that shot
through
because
their
that
overt
is one of
symbolism,
the
are
most
in
beautiful
fact
pieces of art
much
in
more
Pompeii,
Jewish
just
in
due
their
to
intent
its
than
mastery of
representation.
mastery of
In
painting
review,
and
the
the
archaeological
accuracy
evidence conveys
in
that
how they're
icons
depicting
were
the
used
figures.
in a participatory fashion and were the direct objects of veneration themselves, like mezuzahs. Second century written evidence further corroborates this. The Gnostic Acts of John criticizes
And
someone
so
for
here,
making
this
an
is where
icon drawing
finally,
and venerating it
and it's
in
like
its
halfway
honor.
through the film,
The
we
author
detach
clearly
more than
understood
we
this
detach
to
from
be faithful
archaeology, right?
practice,
We spend all this
no
time in
faith
archaeology, and
outside the
finally we
field
start
of
getting to
ancient
here's
Christianity
explicit statements
disagreed
that
with
say
it.
how icons were used.
Irenaeus, an Orthodox
And
source, relates
of course, the
Gnostic
only
group
explicit
that
statements that
crowned
discuss their use
something he
are all
mentions naturally,
iconodullic. And
only to
so
then criticize
the
the same
viewer
group
now
for other
already
modes of
agrees
veneration,
with the
like those of the
thesis and
pagans,
can now
probably sacrificial.
contextualize
The fact that
what
later
these
merited
written
criticism,
statements
but not
mean.
the former,
While
implies the former was
usually in
acceptable
this
and
debate,
likely
we're looking
common
at
during the
written
pre-Nicene
statements
era,
detached
due
from
to it not
imagery,
being
detached from
propitiatory.
archaeology, floating in midair,
Scholarship in
so to
recent
say.
years has begun
So
recognizing the preceding.
it's a very
Matthews
different
and Miller
approach, and which is
observed,
why I really
icons were
wanted my
intimately
final
connected
say
with
on
the
the
origins
icon
and
issue
growth of
to be
Christianity itself.
audiovisual. And great scholarly quote there, which pretty much shows you, scholarship doesn't believe the thesis of the film, and
With the
and there I
legalization of
quote that there.
Christianity by the Emperor Constantine, and later it being the
So
mandate
anyway,
religion
this
of
part of the
Roman
film I
Empire by
found
the
very
Emperor
important, Jose,
Theodosius, icons did not
because
instantly acquire the typical
people
look
just
we
want the
have
proof
today.
iconodulia,
Carvings and
but I think what they
statuary with
really
realistic
need
portrayals
is
typical of
to
Greco-Roman art
connect
remained
what we
common.
have that looks before
Certain frescoes
that looks very
likewise
different with what
included
we have
essence of
now.
realism.
So you
On the
need
other
some
hand,
sort of
Yes.
discussion
overtly
of
symbolic
canonical icons,
representations
which is what
likewise
this whole chapter is
persisted.
about. Why?
Most
How did
notably
we get
during this era
icons that
is
have
what
the same
appears to be a
doctrine of the
deliberate decision
anti-Nicene
among
icons, but
artists
look like the
and
icons we have
iconographers
today?
to combine elements of realism and symbolism into their depictions. This became so persistent that particularly during this century, one can begin to recognize icons from that time that are little different from those still made today. St. Gregory of Nyssa described one icon.
So right
in his
here, I
homily
would say
in
you
praise of
probably,
Blessed
as the
Theodore,
maker
great
of the
martyr,
film,
where the
you find
saint's
this to be
body
a little more
appears as
like
if it were alive
picture
and healthy.
words, right? A little
Eyes,
less
mouth,
visually
ears, as well as
demanding.
the other
Yeah, I was gonna
symbols
mention
are
this part
cause
is
for
more
pouring out tears of reverence and emotion.
PowerPoint mode, let's say.
The contemporary Christian poet
It's
Prudentius
until you get into the
likewise
gold glass
describes an
icons,
icon of
and
Lucian of Imola
we'll talk a little bit
that
about that.
depicted
But
his martyrdom
beautiful
in a
iconography
picture
there,
painted in colors, bearing 1,000 words,
from the
all his
Byzantine
clothes
era.
torn,
And
showing his
again,
skin
these
broken
written
with
statements,
tiny
which we
pricks
already now
that
accept there was
caused the
icons
shedding of
before
tears
ante-Nicene
and
period,
prayer.
but statements that show
These
past period,
descriptions,
this sort
which
of
describe
iconodultic
art that is
understanding
not merely
persisted,
portraiture, but
and
designed to evoke a
how
reverential response,
from
imply that the
normal
artist
people
employed
throughout the Christian
symbolism
world, there wasn't
achieve
just
the
one little
intended
thing or
effect
one
upon
passage, but
onlookers.
all over the place.
Archaeological finds demonstrate this inference to be fact.
For example, the frescoes of Saints Peter and Paul
So again, right, we have everyone pointing towards Christ in the painting, very similar to the Orants. So it's serving the same purpose.
This is
And it's
one of the
interesting,
greatest frescoes.
right? We're familiar with this kind of fresco, right? So we look at that and go, of course it was venerated. But yet when we see the Good Shepherd with things pointing at it and praying in the same way, there's some sort of doubt in people's mind, right? But it's because of lack of familiarity. It's not because people aren't familiar with how art's employed. And right, and I think that's kind of visually driven home there.
Christological controversies requiring more theologically transparent depictions and the decree of Gentile conversions.
So right now we get the rationale as to why this change in artistic vision occurs, because of this Christological controversy.
Christian iconography. Purely symbolic depictions, such as Christ being depicted as a lamb, were eventually
right, and
out of existence
there
by
goes
conciliar
the
king, specifically because
the
of
purely
potential
symbolic
for Christological
depictions, and
confusion.
we start getting these
Though to
kind of
this day,
cool
overt symbolism is
mashups
sometimes retained in
of
icons,
symbolism
such as
and
John the
real.
Baptist being
But
portrayed
I
as
just
an
wanted to
angel,
point out
or
we
Saint
still have the
Christopher as a
grossly
dog-headed
symbolic,
saint.
like with Saint
Only a
Christopher.
small
And I
minority
say
of
grossly
icons are like
because
that.
like people go, oh, you never have
canonical
symbolism anymore.
icon
You've totally
divining
changed. Like, no,
realism
we
and
still maintain
symbolism
it in some
is
quarters, even
realistic
to this day.
inasmuch that what it represents
So
is
again, an
true and
inclusion
identifiable.
in order
It is
to
also
address
symbolic
a
due to
potential
its
polemical
idealized
objection.
portrayal having intentional theological significance. To prevent confusion, iconographers, according to Epiphanius, a 4th century writer, identified them
And
with
right, so now we have
inscriptions
this
written on each of
4th
the
century
images.
attestation of
Inscriptions
why
were
they
intended to
started
historically
actually
ground the
spelling out
depictions upon
who was on the
real
icon.
such
And
as
so
Jesus
this
Christ
really
or the
addresses
saints.
that, yes, this was in response to these
Manifesting
theological
continuity with
controversies.
pre-Nicene
And it's
Christian
this
art,
interesting
canonical icons
polemical
retained their
inversion
ritualistic
of
use,
Saint
where they were
Epiphanius,
means of
because he's so
blessing,
often employed
exorcism,
as
and
proof
veneration
against
of the prototypes,
iconodulia
the
and
people who
looked at
represented.
historically,
Epiphanius
and
records that
it's
the
actually
majority of
exact
clergy
opposite.
defended icon veneration, explaining that instead of treating icons as idols which receive sacrifices, we make images of the
Right, so
saints
here's a
in
quote from Saint
and we prostrate
Epiphanius where
ourselves in
he
front of
spells
them
out, here's how
before them.
everyone thought they were used.
Corroborating the ubiquity of the
Now this
practice
is
in the
great.
4th century of both
You were saying, but I
venerating
want to
and
use all the color
identifying figures
pictures,
and icons
because look what
as
you do here with
attested
all
to
these
by
images moving.
Epiphanius is a treasure
And they're
trove of
beautiful
dozens of
images
gold
here. I
glass
mean,
Gotta
tell me
shout
what
out-
the putting this
Gotta
together.
shout out
Conversely, dated
Shadrick
from the 3rd and
for
5th
doing the
centuries.
sound
Dozens
for not only
of
this, but
icons
obviously the whole
contain
movie.
inscriptions
But
explicitly specifying
for this right here,
icons were
this was one of those things where you
as
mentioned where
apotrope
while you're
and used with
actually
prayers.
editing, you
For
find
example,
stuff.
one icon
So
of
when
Saint Laurentius of Rome
I forget like the
contains the prayer,
images that you
"Lord,
actually link in
may
the
you
script
live
was
in the
only
name
like a
of
handful.
Laurentius."
But
There are
then
many others
in
like
my
this.
research
One
trying to
icon
find
of
other
Christ
images, I found
invoking Saints Peter
a whole
and
treasure
Paul,
trove
invoking them
of
by
all
name
these
for
images,
blessing,
and I was like, oh,
contains the
I have to
inscription,
somehow include all of
"You are
these.
the honor of
Now
your
to
friends.
briefly interrupt, that's
May
why you
you
didn't
live
like
with
some of these
relation,
because they were
real
black and
life."
white.
Another icon makes
No,
But
yeah, some of them I
we
was like,
have literal
"Ah."
images with
named
prayers
are
written on them.
conduits of
So
God's
again, people
blessing.
say, "Oh,
You
yeah, we
are
don't know how
the
the
honor
image was
of your
used,"
friends.
and this
May
again
you
is
have
addressed.
peace
We
with God.
have icons
Elsner's
with
myths
prayers
contain
written on
these
them.
gold
There's,
glass
it's
icons.
not just like,
There's
oh,
every
look, Christ is
possibility that
holding a
these
wand.
kinds of images
This
were
must
put to
mean
private
that it
devotional
was
use,
apotropaic. Like,
whether in
no,
a
there's
funerary
prayers written on
context
them,
where the
and the
surviving
scholarship that's
materials were
quoted on
found,
screen
in a
shows that
liturgical
scholars
space,
are aware of this.
or in
It's
the domestic arena.
there's every
During
possibility.
this same era,
There's this
a
read
balance
and
was
say, of
struck
course they
between
were.
not making
But,
depictions too
I'm an
realistic,
apologist.
so that
Okay,
what was
I could say,
portrayed
of course they
appeared to
were. I don't
exist
have
merely
to
for
be
depiction's
impartial
sake,
for the sake of
but also not
publishing
so
something here.
symbolic that the icon
Nice
bore no
touch you did here,
relation to
by the
what
way.
or whom it represented.
Thank you,
For
yeah.
example,
Try to.
Jesus Christ, the light of the
It was
world,
black and white, so I had
was
to do
given a
something.
halo.
And I
Earliest
guess
examples
again
of
that
such being dated to the
apotropaic,
3rd century.
right? That this
Beginning in
image
the
serves a
mid-4th
purpose for
century,
the dead
the
person
saints
there,
who
almost like the image is a
shine
kind of
forth as
prayer
brightly
for
as the
the
sun in
salvation
heaven
Yeah,
of
really
the
quick.
person buried
Back
there.
on that gold glass, the Christ holding the
Differentiate
wand.
between Christ and the saints, the one
I
who
don't
is
think that one
source of
actually
grace,
had text
and
on
those
it,
who are
so it
filled with
functioned
divine
more
grace.
like
The former's halo was
a quote
given the
unquote
sign of the
amulet,
cross.
apotropaic,
The
kind of like an
earliest known
icon
icon
today,
that was not unearthed
Mhm.
but
by
without
archaeological finds,
as much
the
text.
Pantocrator, is
But then
dated
it's
from the 6th
connected. It's in
century.
that gold glass
It
tradition,
combines all the elements of the
but it's
canonical
Christian.
icon in a realistic flourish.
It does show you that again,
Yet as
it's
Semitic, in
people want
contrast with
from
earlier
the
symbolic
art
portrayals,
it to
making
spell
them
out with
appear
like
as
instructions.
figures,
One, you pray
refuge,
toward. Two,
or
to get your
creation of
answer
the
prayed,
Greco-Roman king.
prayer answered.
However,
Three,
his face
and that's
the
not
Sinai
that's
icon
not realistic for
strikes
art.
an
So the fact we
unrealistic
found
pose with
any
its
art
obvious
that's like
symbolism.
this is quite
One
incredible.
side exuding the compassion of a
But
merciful
it's
God,
consistent
the other
with
portraying
the review
seriousness
of
the second
archaeology
coming
and
when he
everything in
will
the beginning
judge
of the
the world.
film, which which is why you could come to the conclusion here with the canonical icons fairly quickly, and everything makes sense.
I just noticed with it's Christ Pancrator from Sinai, when it's the side of him that's, let's say, in judgment, he's holding the two books, kind of
Yep.
like the letter of the law. while the mercy is just his hands. So more like the
Yeah.
spirit of the Lord. I just noticed that now.
In the book of Revelation, there's books of judgment, right? The books of life. So,
Of course.
and now there's this juxtaposition in the conclusion film that puts everything to the end. Everything gets connected together. And I try to address that a lot of the misunderstanding of this whole issue is because the Western paradigm. And that's so trite because everything West is bad when we talk about this stuff, and not necessarily so. But what is bad is that when we become detached from the actual purpose of symbolism in this art, it creates a theological distancing of how this art is to be understood. And so that's why this conclusion was necessary. And it wasn't just like, oh, this is Craig Truglia, so he's got to somehow figure out a way to bash Roman Catholics in the end or something. But it was to actually address, why is it that we don't immediately make these associations with the art, while someone who's Orthodox with Orthodox icons all around very easily does, and almost alien not to. And it's because the style of the art in the West doesn't give itself to be an icon. Now, Jose, you like Western art, so I wonder how you felt, if you felt scandalized at all when you were trying to portray this.
I was gritting my teeth editing this part. No, I mean, I more or less agree with that. When you see a Caravaggio painting, you don't immediately think, oh, I have to go and venerate and kiss this painting. You kind of take it more as, oh, this is like art. Maybe that's also an issue nowadays with museums, where art is created to put in a museum rather than it's being patronized in somebody's house. So I do agree. It does have that feel towards, if you look at an icon, like you said, it feels alien to not venerate it. But a painting, it's like it's natural to just appreciate it for its beauty rather than taking it in as a prayerful sort of experience.
Dr. Stephen Bigham liked this part right here, because he's like, yeah, the Jews and the Muslims are detached from original Judaism because they clearly had images. And here, right, beautiful art that you picked, all of it, but so clear, these aren't icons. This wasn't the intent of their creation, right? You could tell the artist to the left was trying to make an icon, right? The artist to the right was trying to make beautiful art. And this creates theological confusion. How do you address this whole issue without addressing this large question? And really, this is the whole book of the whole point of the book from Dr. and Father Stephen Bigham on the issue of Romanesque art. And this is why I felt it was so important that it needed inclusion in this film. And what a great painting that is. I love that painting.
Oh yeah, this is beautiful, beautiful art.
And
for whatever reason, it's not used in let's say a liturgy. So it's like, why is that the case?
And right here, right, the script says the art's beautiful, but it's not an icon. Oftentimes it's didactic, right? It's to teach us God is here today. He's here even with us, which is why they're dressed with contemporary garb. And Jesus is made to look more accessible. So there's a theological point, but it's not properly an icon. And it's interesting, proper icons still exist when it comes to crucifixes, because the cross itself is a symbol. Yeah. And so it shows you implicitly people understand that the melding of the symbolic with the real is an icon. And I found out making this that the Anglicans, when they do the Stations of the Cross, still actually venerate the holy image. So there's still literal iconodulia within Anglicanism, but it's because they're familiar with that on Good Friday that they don't consider it a difference with they don't understand it's a commonality they share between us and the Orthodox, which I find very interesting. It shows you a lot of the problem is not intellectual, it is spiritual, and has to do with what people are spiritually familiar with or not.
In the present age as they did in the past. This is why canonical icons demand over millennia the same sort of treatment and understanding that they have always received. More innovative art forms from
and right in here again, that juxtaposition between iconodulic art and just religious art.
But could somebody venerate this painting by El Greco?
They could try. It's not going to come naturally though, right? And this is why all these apologists are confused. you know, because they'll say this stuff, it's a development, it didn't exist. And it's all across the board, because in Western theology, there's this theological confusion because the art changed.
Is challenged in the modern day on how to keep advancing his
beautiful ending, by the way,
all the more retaining the
with just people making icons
of iconographic art itself. It is this challenge and the
Yeah, I
grace
think
of
this
God
was
which always has
the idea
and
from the
will
beginning,
continue
to find
to
images of
inspire
people
increasingly beautiful
creating icons.
lifetimes of canonical.
and the music comes in. The music's beautiful. It almost brings a tear to your eye. I don't think you could have ended this more perfectly. And the text on screen makes you want to cry, because it shows you the person who saw the image with the person venerating the donkey-headed Christ. The Christian who saw it go, yes, that person venerating the crucifix was actually faithful. And it's like, whoa. It drives home how our brothers in Christ across the ages identified this. And just look at this ending with the music, just gorgeously done, 10 frames per second, and just kind of like this classic, gives it this classic timeless feel that this is important, right? That you're going for here. And in my credits, I purposely thank a lot of people, including Gavin Ortlund, because I didn't want people to think this was strictly like a response to Gavin Ortlund, because it wasn't. This is stuff I've been doing for a long time before he had forays in the topic, and hence their names precede his for that reason. So, you know, if you don't mind, if you could give me some of your comments, Jose, on the ending here, because like, what was going through your mind when you put that together?
Well, I'm glad you noticed that it was a lower frame rate, because I do like that feel when it's, 10, 12 frames, and then maybe another part is 30 frames a second. So the ending was, it was kind of, when I first read it, the script, so this is like back in early 2024, the idea since the beginning was to have it kind of be like one of those classic Kenneth Clark art documentaries, but obviously we can't go to the location. And then that's why I do use the Kenneth Clark footage throughout the movie. So the ending was kind of trying to emulate that feel. And then also to have the credit sequence look appealing so that the people stick to it, so that you can also then see, who's involved in the project, then who's also thanks that at the end. So that was just the thought process behind it.
I mean, let me ask you this. Was it intentionally epic, or just was its epicness by mistake? Because it really does it's like when, I don't know if you're quite old enough for this, but when I was younger, I remember playing video games, and if you beat a video game and had lousy final credits, it wasn't so epic. But if it had like really epic final credits, it almost like was a majestic experience when you're a kid to beat this video game. So like finishing the film was very like majestic and epic. Like, was that intention, or it just came across that way?
You mean when we see the final text of Alex Menos?
And yes, and then it goes into credits.
Okay, yeah. So I think when I got to the Alexa Menos graffito part in the actual movie, so like I think it's chapter 3, when I was looking for the images for the actual graffito itself, and then I was wondering, like, oh, do they have an actual picture of the inscription? On Wikipedia, it had that thing that, in the chamber next to his is that. And then I looked around to see if I could find it, but I couldn't. But then I kept that in mind. And I think when I first read it, I went back to the script. I went all the way to the end, and then I put it. I think it's still there if you open up the script, and it says ending. Alexa Menos is faithful. And I just put it there, like, and this was weeks before we got to the ending. So that was always there, that was going to be the ending. And then for the actual background of the people painting the icons, that was also in mind as well. Like, oh, let's kind of bring together now with people creating icons. But then also I was trying to find footage that fits that Kenneth Clark, 1960s, 1970s style. But then if you notice in the film, as we work towards the end and it's that final person painting the icon, and then the text comes up, you notice the black bars kind of go off to the side, because that footage is from the I think it's the Proforos School. It's on YouTube, but it's from 2011, so it's like a new footage to try to bring that connection. Like, oh, we saw all these icons painted throughout the centuries, and then we have also this footage from monasteries from the 1960s and 70s, and then still today, people painting and making the same type of icons. So then those two images, the icon painting and then the text, that came together. And then the music, that was Chris. If you saw the Chris Shattuck,
special props.
he's the one who picked that out and found it. So
Now,
if
when
it feels epic, I'd say it's mainly because of the music, that energy kind of dun, 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 and that, to his credit, that's him.
he did a fantastic job. When I first saw the rough draft of the film and it didn't have music, it was good, but there was almost like a soul missing from it, where it almost came across as a kind of dry 1970-ish documentary or 1980-ish like History Channel or A&E documentary. Yeah. And then with the music, it really brought it to life. And the way you integrate it is done so well. It really is a work of art, and I'm very appreciative of it. And that's why, like, it's a shame people go like, oh, Craig's icon film. Because the reality is, I'm maybe 10% of this. Because I understand without the script, you couldn't do what was done here, right? But all the accents and the visual elements and everything that you put together, that if you would have made this film with anyone else's script, it still would have been a good film, right? A very good film. And so I'd like to think maybe my 10% puts it over the top. But you would still have a greatest hit, I think, on your hand without the script. It's I think what you guys put together with the music and the visuals did a fantastic job.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say this. You can have there's many videos online where it's heavy on style, but the substance kind of isn't there, or it's the other way. There's a lot of substance, but the style is okay. Well, this is just, we're just seeing some images here, some text. So really, and then also, let's also throw in the audio here as well, where the audio is very high quality, crisp audio, but maybe it's lacking substance, or it's the other way where it's very dense, but it's just some guy talking. So it really all comes together to make it something that's more than just, like you said, like a school documentary that you would watch. It's something that kind of has a little finesse to it. So yeah,
now,
so Frony doing the voiceover, Chris with the music, and then everybody that did the research, the script.
Now, I'm sharing screen on the wrong thing. 1 second. 1 second. I don't want to kick you out. Let's see. If I remove that from studio, does this come up? There we go. Wait, we're getting there. So before you do audience questions, I just want to remind people that donations to Church Cambodia is really the main motivating factor behind my work. And so I just want to do plugs for that. We have orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, Venmo, PayPal, Patreon to support the Church of Cambodia. Links are all below. It makes possible this show and made possible the film and the wee hours of the morning working on this thing, and just to make a film like this possible for people. If this film has really helped you, please bless the church in Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below. $10 donation helps translate a saint's life into Khmer that's never been translated before. And we're raising money to help fix the church in Sihanoukville. Its gate was destroyed. We need $4,500 to fix it, to build the whole wall around it that was destroyed by the local government. So please, 45 people, $100 donations gets the job done. And so we've had 185,000 people so far watch this film. And please show some of your love for the film by showing love for the Church of Cambodia, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Again, links are below. Jose, we have you from DO Creative. How could people bless you?
I can go to the channel and watch the videos there. I guess we can link it. And then also just pray for the Orthodox Church in Brazil. They need priests. They need outreach. So I'm saying
So your prayers.
that's it for me.
All right. So we got some audience questions. Does Jose work with Harmony? Like, what is your
Yes.
collaboration with them?
Well, so Frony from Harmony, him and I have been friends since high school. And then we've always just been making stuff together and apart. And then once I became Orthodox, he became Orthodox. It was only natural that we would try to collaborate and make Orthodox stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So then the collaboration is just that, like, if I have on some of my videos, I'm like, hey, I need a voiceover. He'll help me out with the voice. Or if he needs some sort of animation or editing on a certain video, he'll reach out to me. And then it's collaboration like that.
Sophrony's voice is the narrator in History of the Papacy in 12 minutes. So
Exactly.
he finds his way in collaborations between all of us.
That's what I tell him. I'm like, he's the voice of all the Orthodox films.
There you go. He becomes like that guy that does all of the coming attractions. And I'm adding a link to Dio Creative into the chat box, and we will link to it in the sticky comment for the film. We have phylacteries are depicted in certain prophets' iconography, right? Like Daniel. And really the main thing the film's trying to address is that this is not some sort of medieval Jewish thing that like people are maybe overly reading to the past, but they actually did exist in the early church because St. Justin Martyr talks about them. We have this. Can we turn the background sound down? And we were talking about this a little during the film. Again, this is a director's commentary, so the sound is there so you could kind of place what the comments are for. And I had another comment where the person was saying that, could you just put the sound all the way up? Like, no, you watch the film for that. This is a director's commentary. They're meant to be listened to separately. So that's my apology in the true sense of the term for that stuff. We have this, the link to the documentary in the description. So you could watch after this. Thank you, Dr. Kissinger. So he says, just watch the film in the description. We would really appreciate that. God's Lion Boy says, St. Epiphanius simply condemned a non-kosher icon. He's talking about, I think, letter 51 in St. Jerome's epistolary, which was probably realistic instead of symbolic or simply unholy. Also, icons were also already used by Saint Emperor Severus in the 2nd century. Now, I'm not sure of the second story in the top of my head about Emperor Severus, but I will make note that the curtain could have been some sort of pagan or heavily symbolic image, because we know from St. Epiphanius, he says some image they said was Christ or the saints, right? So it wasn't clear what it was, which kind of implies it was one of these repurposed pagan images like the Good Shepherd or something like that. So that's something we do know. And it shows you like we could read St. Epiphanius anachronistically in that letter, presuming all his other letters are inauthentic, and he might have just had artistic squabbles with icons. Though I would say, judging from his other, the fragments of his other epistolary, that it does seem like he had some sort of beef against icons himself personally. And he says that only a few people listened to him. So he was in a very small minority. And there's many saints alive in the late 4th century, like all the Cappadocians and stuff. So this would imply that this is not a near consensus view on his end. It's actually the opposite. So that on St. Epiphanius anyway. We have this. I miss Father Stefan. Will you have Stephen? Will you have him back on the channel? And Father Stephen Bigham's always invited on. It's just a matter of us coming up with a topic that works with all of us. I think the next one might be an in-person interview, because one of these days I'm going to go to Montreal because I don't live that far. And if I'm going to do that, I'm going to hit Father Stephen Bigham, eat at a local, normal Montreal restaurant, and maybe we'll have a sit-down interview and do it that way. And then I'll be real professional, Jose. I'll be like Pints of Aquinas, in-person interviews. What do you think?
That's good. It's the future, right? Got to bring your whole setup.
Maybe one day we do a in-person interview. Next time, To be perfectly honest, I'm trying to think when I'm down there next. Because I'd say, just so you know, if you're in town Labor Day, we won't say what towns for everyone's privacy. You're in town Labor Day, I'll be going to church at your church. Because
Okay, yeah.
oftentimes I go church on my way home when I'm visiting the city. And so when that occurs, I can't be at that church for that reason. Also, outside possibility would be last week of this month because I'm going to a wedding downstate on Sunday. So we shall see. We'll talk privately about that stuff because it'd be fun just to hang out again. We have this. The Latin Church of Rome was consumed by abominable and pious pagan Renaissance art, which is true. Renaissance, it's beautiful. So, but is it pagan? Obviously so. They were purposely repurposing pagan art forms. Like that was the point with the statuary, done as it's done and all that. Like that's the ethos of Renaissance art. In fact, Renaissance art is the only art I have done any learning about at the college level. Right. So like we have all these people commenting on art history, and I'm not an art historian, but at least I actually took one class in art history. So like I'm aware of how historians deal with the subject, and I've read art history anyway. It's not my profession, but there you go. You say canonical iconography, but isn't it true that there are no specific canons on how to write icons? And that's a good point. There is, of course, one canon, the Council of Trullo, Canon 82, which says we can't use pictures of icons of an actual literal lamb. But that being said, canons also pertain to what's just the normative and expected in the church, right? And so, plus we have a canon that kind of regulates icons of the Father, the Council of Moscow, 1666. So there's canons that exist, but when we speak of canonical icon, we speak about recognizable normative Orthodox iconography. I don't know if you have any comments on that as the real artiste of the bunch here, Jose.
I always found that the lamb presentation of Christ in art, that was cool. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. But then I do understand why you'd want to kind of shy away from it.
Yeah,
but
there's
that is the one that, remember we spoke about during the commentary. It's like, oh, when we got to this Western art part, how'd you feel about it? I agree with all of that, but I'd say the one thing that I'm like, oh no, like it would be nice if we could go symbolic in that way, would be with the lamb and like certain other things, maybe
make a comeback. Yeah, I think like one thing that got regulated out of existence, which was original to the church. So, right, lamb depiction is a very symbolic depiction, which is very authentically ante-Nicene, right? In that sense, maybe the lamb itself is not ante-Nicene, but approaching art in that fashion is very ante-Nicene. Something else that's ante-Nicene, and even quite a bit after that, is tasting milk and honey after baptism. It was considered initiatory into the promised land, the spiritual promised land. And it was considered near universal. Like St. Jerome said, it has the force of law due to its universality. And so it's kind of a shame that we have a Trullan canon that regulates it out of existence as well, because apparently people started conflating it with pagan rites. And so we have lost some. Yeah, and right, this is where like I would make the world's best Protestant apologist if I were Protestant, because like there are things that are original to the church, which were actually considered very fundamental and important and intrinsic to universal practices, that have disappeared or near disappeared. Romanians still have a practice with a milk and honey bath. So like we kind of keep it there somewhat, but there have been things that have been canonically regulated out of existence. And this would require a whole other video to kind of defend it or just say there is no good answer to this. But I do think the milk and honey initiatory rite, if I had my way, would make a comeback, because I don't think anyone today would confuse it with paganism. But it's kind of like where Jesus speaks of the bread and healings on the Sabbath, like when he says, well, David ate the bread, the consecrated bread. Yeah. Right? God cares for our salvation more than historical and legalistic authenticity, right? There is a purpose to those things, but ultimately they're secondary to our salvation. And so I do think that's worth talking about. But then we maybe need another church canon to to bring it back in order to do that. So we're going to continue here. Bodiless Voice says, it would be interesting to hear a discussion of the specific nature of the historic anathemas against iconoclasts. And I'll just say briefly that let's look at this in a couple of ways. First, is iconodulia apostolic? I think the film shows demonstrably, maybe not this, what we just did with our commentary of the film, but watch the original film uninterrupted, that yes, it's scripturally commanded. It's apostolically normative. And we have St. Dionysius, who knew the apostles, who's mentioned in Acts chapter 17, saying that you need these things, right? So they're necessary. So what do we do with people that forbid us and dissuade us from necessary religious practices? Well, we curse them, right? That in the Old Testament, they cursed those people who defied what was scripturally normative. In the New Testament, we cursed those people that defied what was scripturally normative. In the early church, we cursed those people that defied what was normative of the consensus of the church, whether all these Christological doctrines and eventually icons. So that's the first thing. It's nothing wrong with condemning people that are telling you and dissuading you not to conduct a necessary practice, because iconodulia is one of the things necessary for salvation. It's not uniquely necessary for salvation. It's possible to be saved if you never venerated an icon, because let's say the thief on the cross didn't live long enough to do so. But could you continue living and then reject something that's useful towards your salvation? And I'll leave it to God to know for how long, but yes, it's just like crashing into a wall could kill you, and you shouldn't do that, and you should wear a seatbelt. And we'd condemn people that say you shouldn't wear a seatbelt. It's dangerous for you. Same thing, those who say you shouldn't venerate icons, they would be dissuading you from something that's salvific for you, that has power. And so is iconodulia as important as, let's say, the Eucharist? No, but are both important for our salvation? Answer is yes. And do anathemas dissuade people from trying to remove these things? Of course, right? We would curse people that would not partake the sacrament in the Eucharist and things like that. So that'd be my comment there. And of course, Jose, if you got any comments, I know you're not really the apologist here. You can feel free to interject. You're more than welcome to. I'll make this one other note, by the way, on anathemas, right? As I already referred to before, they're in the Old Testament. They're in the New Testament, so they're in the scriptures. They're universally in the early church. And no one does them today other than the Eastern Orthodox. The Roman Catholics don't do them anymore. In fact, they're canonically off the books. The Oriental Orthodox only have historical anathemas from 1,500 years ago. The Protestants don't do them. The only people that still have anathemas today are the Eastern Orthodox. In fact, our most recent set are from 1985. And so, it's kind of interesting where this sort of this boogeyman that we got to distance ourselves from anathemas is actually the opposite. It's a hallmark of an authentic church. It's the authentic hallmark, the people of God, that we actually have church discipline, that we anathematize things. So something worth pointing out anyway. Also on a lighter and I think somewhat humorous note, Hieromonk Maximus Simonos Petras seems to become offended whenever someone refers to icons as art. That seems overcorrect, but there it is. Yeah, that kind of, there's some passions involved, I think, when that stuff. I saw someone get offended because someone said written an icon as opposed to painted an icon.
Yeah.
And in hagiographies, the word written is used because icon is not merely art, it's a spiritual expression. So I don't know. You're the artist here. I don't know if you have any comments.
They use the word, what word did they use? Graphos or?
Yeah, there was a person, a pious person, who talked about a written icon, and this other commenter got angry at that person, saying, I hate when people use written. It's overly pious, essentially.
No. I'm saying what word in the Greek that's used. Because I've seen that too, where people are like, oh, we're not painting an icon, we're writing.
Greek, to be honest. my guess is this, that both words in the Greek are used in various contexts.
Sure.
If you
I
want
know,
my opinion, but
Mhm.
that's just a flying guess anyway.
I think
yeah.
you could call it art because nowadays everybody, like in our context, that like you understand what art means, and then it's like, okay, yeah, that's art. We don't have to. I do think it's cool saying like, oh, I wrote this icon, right? There's a like it sounds cool, but it might. I guess maybe some people are like, oh, why are you trying to be different or something? It's just art.
Yeah, trying to be different for different sake. And that is a problem with an orthodoxy because it's not a dominant religion in the United States. So like by default, we're all a little different, right? We think a little differently. We're countercultural. But orthodoxy is not supposed to be countercultural or dominant culture. It's supposed to be out of this world, really, right? And so for that reason, it's sort of like I could see why just in the cultural landscape, we have the kind of diversity and countercultural elements that we do. Now we got this. No doubt Mr. Trulli would be good at anything he sets his mind to. He's a bright young man. One, I'm not young. I'm on the wrong side of 40. So let me correct the record there.
Thanks,
I am
Grandma.
not young. You know, I am at the age where people think I'm my 20s. So I'll go, thank you. But I am definitely not, nor do I feel as such. I'm in tons of pain and all this. So anyway, I'm an old man. But that being said, it's I'm not bright. I remember my wife had she got a new engineering job, right? So she tried in the beginning doing her old engineering job part-time as a side job. And I said to my wife, what if I learned to do this structural engineering stuff using AutoCAD? So that way we just make extra money because we were poorer back then. Right? We're not poor now. Like we were poor back then. So like, why not do that? And I really tried and I couldn't do it. Right. So it's like I reached a mental limit. So I am well aware of my mental limits, and maybe someone should interview me and ask me what are your mental limits, and I could get into those. But there you go. That's what I think of my alleged brightness. Disagree about Saint Epiphanius. His argument against others at the time is surely about certain types of depictions, not the icons we mean, and the way they shouldn't be placed or displayed. Now, top of my head, I think that's hard as square with his letter to Saint Theodosius the Great, where he does seem to take this overall condemnatory view of icons. But we could agree to disagree. And honestly, I want to agree with you. So go into detail and show where I'm wrong and vindicate Saint Epiphanius by all means. By all means, I don't say that facetiously. I want to be wrong about this. We have this. I wish Dia Creative would upload more. I love his work so much.
I know.
Come on, Jose.
we're working on some things.
We're working on it.
While.
Orthodox Loner did a video on icons just recently, and people should check that out. And he should link to my video. Darn it.
Yes, I did see
it. Let's see. And we have art is for it. Icons are not art. Art is for a vain purpose of decoration or earthly beauty, which isn't entirely vain. I think God is an artist. I think like it's like when God makes parts of the universe we've never seen. God's amusing himself at that point, I feel, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with beauty for beauty's sake in that sense, right? Like flowers in your garden and whatnot. It's very like St. Augustine almost became this very anti-art, had this very anti-art view from a practical spiritual standpoint. Apparently the masses were allowed to have icons because he mentions them, but he felt for the spiritually initiated and the, I guess high-end spirituality that we were supposed to start becoming detracted from art and beauty. So there's this kind of I wouldn't say God's Lion Boy is wrong here. This sort of extreme form of asceticism where we start becoming detached from things that are physically beautiful and in some context. And there's saints that attain to theosis, like Augustine, that had that view. I do think overall, though, that what's most useful to salvation is like the advice just be normal, right? So it's good to have beautiful things. And this is why one of the good things to be married, women are just better with interior design. than men. Like, I didn't choose this bookshelf behind me, right? If you want to go, well, what did Craig choose? It would be when I had the flag behind me, and even that was a lot of effort for me, right? Like,
I was boy mode with the flag.
yeah, it's like, I don't know. I'm just down to the aesthetics. I want to deal with doing the work and not the aesthetics. But the aesthetics are necessary because we're not detached spirits floating in outer space, right? We're psychosomatic beings. We have this from Bodilius' voice, where he says, and my Greek's not good enough, Zoira Theo, on the other hand, is the ancient Greek word used to describe drawn from life, indicating the norms of pagan and secular art. To my knowledge, the church only used the word ikonoira Theo. Well, that's the word icon with something else in the end. So there you go.
Right here at 1125, it means literally image writing.
I see. And so, in a sense, maybe the pagan word is the wrong one, I guess. I don't know. Maybe hagiographically, a different word's used. And we have agreed to disagree. Augustine is 100% correct. Our saints taught that Christians stay away from earthly things. So there you go. He agrees with Augustine. And anyway, we have that other Greek term. In ancient usage reflects the Greek materialist bias in art, that is to say, perfect or near perfect idealist things like the David, which is a beautiful piece of art with really giant hands, right? If you've ever seen the hands on that thing. So there you go. We're out of audience questions. So Jose, let me just give my thanks to you again. Let you do your victory lap for your fantastic work with the hidden history of early Christian art. May God bring many more people to watch it and enjoy it.
Yes.
And I'm very grateful. I hope there's a timeless quality to the art, which is hard to, of course, predict in the present, because there's an artistic ethos in the present where it looks great, right? And the question is how something aged. My opinion is it will age great. There's a documentary aspect about it, which I think will help it age in a sense, which we'll still be watching it 10 years from now. That's what I think.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the hope, that it's something that's like a fountain that keeps on flowing for many people for a long time.
And that's why I'm going to take this file of the video and put it in a flash drive and put it in my fireproof safe.
Every time you copy it, it loses quality every time you copy it. So it's like one of those things we pass it around till eventually it's 480p.
There you go. That's right. Watch the original on Harmony. And so my thanks again to Jose. My thanks again to all the viewers. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. Like, subscribe, and share Hidden History of Early Christian Art. And of course, bless the churches of Cambodia. Makes videos like this possible by going to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below. And I'll end this show, as I end all of them, by quoting Jesus Rock: fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.